The iPhone 10 and 10s are like identical twins. The only visual difference between them are the speaker grills. One of them is smaller on the iPhone 10s, and that is the only way I can tell which one's which without turning on the screens. In other words, these two phones look exactly the same from the outside. However, I've been using the iPhone 10s for almost a year at this point, and the iPhone 10 for about 4 weeks. And the more I use these phones, the more differences I find between them. So from the inside, these phones are more different than you might think, despite how similar they look from the outside. Like I said, one of the speaker grills on the iPhone 10s is the only visual difference between them because they both have Gorilla Glass on the front and back, the same stainless steel frame, the same notch, the same bezels around the screen, and even the power and volume buttons are in the same spot on both phones. An iPhone 10 case will fit an iPhone 10s, or vice versa. Both phones also fit very nicely in my hands and they feel premium. The iPhone 10 is IP67 water and dust resistant, but the iPhone 10s is IP68. So this is one of the differences between these phones, but it's not something you can tell just by looking at them. So when it comes to build quality and durability, the iPhone 10s is better because of the better IP rating. But I think IP67 is also pretty good and should be good enough for most people, including myself. Although I would never recommend you to purposely submerge these phones in water because the older these phones get, the less water and dust resistant they become. That's just how it is. Now, the screens on both phones are also exactly the same. Literally, there are zero differences between them. But I think that's good because this is a very good screen. I have no complaints about it. It's a very sharp 5.8-inch OLED screen with great contrast, deep blacks, good viewing angles, accurate colors, and a typical max brightness of 625 nits, which makes it visible outdoors. You shouldn't have any problems. Now, these are 60Hz screens, so obviously they're not great in terms of refresh rate, but I've said this before and I'm gonna say it again that if you're switching from a phone with a 60Hz screen, then you will not notice a difference. So there's nothing to worry about. iOS generally feels very smooth on these devices. So even if they're lacking a high refresh rate screen, they should not feel slow. Now, since we're already talking about speed, I think it's a good time to also talk about the processors inside these phones because this is where these phones start being more different than similar. That being said, the iPhone 10 is powered by Apple's A11 Bionic processor and the iPhone 10s is being powered by Apple's A12 Bionic processor. The iPhone 10s has a newer processor, so in theory, it's supposed to be more powerful, faster, efficient, and just better than the A11 Bionic. However, I haven't really noticed a difference between these phones in terms of performance. But I think it's because everyday tasks like calling, texting, and browsing don't push these phones to their limits. So you don't see a difference. But when you do push these phones to their absolute limits, you do start seeing some small differences. For example, when playing graphically intensive games on these phones, like Call of Duty, I've noticed that although both phones perform very well and about the same, meaning there are no frame drops or lag on both phones, the iPhone 10s lets you play with the best graphic settings and the best frame rate settings at the same time. But on the 10, you have to choose between either or. But on top of that, the iPhone 10 heats up significantly more and quicker than the iPhone 10s, which tells me that it's a bit easier for the iPhone 10s to process all that information compared to the iPhone 10. Another difference I've noticed is that when these phones are running really low on battery, they throttle performance, which is fine, but the iPhone 10 starts doing it at around 3%, but the iPhone 10 does it at 1%. These are the differences I've noticed between these phones when it comes to performance. But at the end of the day, these are small differences, and for most of you, they might not even matter. But the reason why I'm telling you about them is because I want to just give you an idea about the difference between the performance of these phones. So, considering the iPhone 10 heats up and throttles performance faster than the iPhone 10s, must mean that the A12 Bionic processor is in fact more efficient and just better than the A11, right? Well, yes, but here's the thing. Apple decided to put a 2658 mAh battery in the iPhone 10s, which is physically smaller than the iPhone 10's 2716 mAh battery. If you're gonna put a physically smaller battery in a phone, then the processor better be efficient enough to at least match the battery life of the older phone, right? Well, that didn't really happen because the iPhone 10 has better battery life. So the processor in this phone is not quite as efficient as I would like it to be. With 79% battery health, I'm able to get around 4 to 4.5 hours of screen on time on the iPhone 10. On the 10s, however, with 78% battery health, I normally get around 3.5 hours to 4 hours of screen on time. So in battery life, the iPhone X beats the XS by roughly 30 minutes, which is a lot of time. But I will say that anything below 5 hours screen on time isn't necessarily good. So the battery life on both phones is definitely on the lower side. But yes, the iPhone X lasts longer than the iPhone XS. Oh yeah, and also, almost forgot about this, but the iPhone XS has 4 gigs of RAM and the iPhone X has 3. So that's also one of the differences. Okay, now I'll quickly tell you about XDR and then we'll talk about the cameras on these phones. Hands down, the biggest difference between these phones. Okay, so I really like what XDR does. Basically, they tear down classic electronic devices and frame them as artwork. An example of that would be the original iPhone, the first Apple Watch, or even the classic Game Boy. So you can buy frames like these from their website, or you can just DIY the whole thing at home if you have an old phone around. And I really like that. I also talked about this in my last video, so they also sent me a DIY kit. And well, I decided to give it a shot. I tried tearing down an iPhone 5S. It wasn't as easy as I thought it would be, but man, was it fun. I highly recommend you to try doing it yourself. And if I ever get another chance, I would 100% do it again. So if you are interested, check out the first link in the description. And if you end up buying something from the website, make sure to use code TechVault at checkout to get 10% off your order. Okay, so when it comes to cameras, again, from the outside, there is no difference. They both have 3 cameras, 12 megapixel wide angle camera and 2x telephoto camera on the back and a 7 megapixel selfie camera. Both phones can even record in the same resolution of up to 4K at 60 frames per second and 1080p at 240 frames per second for slow motion. So on paper, for the most part, the cameras on both phones are exactly the same. However, in actual image quality, the iPhone XS is miles better. If you look carefully, you can clearly see that photos taken from the iPhone XS have way more dynamic range, photos look more detailed, they're brighter, and to me, even the colors look better on the iPhone XS. Same goes for the selfie camera on the iPhone XS. It has more dynamic range, more detail, and better colors in my opinion. I also noticed that the iPhone XS cameras do a much better job of reducing noise in a photo. And speaking of noise, unfortunately, both phones do not have night mode, so they just can't take good photos in low light. Both have a built-in flash, so you can use that at night, but I personally don't like the look of photos in which a flash is used. Portrait mode is also better on the iPhone XS. You can change the depth of field of photos after taking them. Can't do that on the iPhone X. You have no control over depth of field. So when it comes to cameras, the iPhone XS is just better, despite having more or less the same hardware as the iPhone X, which means it's all about the software. Also, fun fact, did you know that selfie cameras on almost all phones don't have autofocus? Okay, I want to make this really quick. So there is another, I guess, big difference between these phones. So you can install iOS 15 on both phones, but because of the A12 Bionic processor, only the iPhone XS has all the new features in iOS 15. Features like live text and a few others are not available on the iPhone X. I totally forgot about this, but thankfully I didn't upload the video. Anyways, but hopefully by now it's clear to you which phone is better. Overall, I think the iPhone XS is better. If you were looking to buy one of these phones, I think it's worth paying a little more for the iPhone XS if it costs more wherever you live. The iPhone X does have a slightly better battery life, but I think the cameras on the iPhone XS outweigh the extra 30 minutes you might get on the iPhone X. So there you have it. That's all for this video. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing and I'll see you later. It's 2 a.m. and I'm recording right now. Please like the video.